wouldn't mind kind of putting it down in the chat, sort of, I'm assuming that everyone in here plays saxophone, but I'm just curious if any of you have done any doubling, played any instruments other than sax, and then maybe just what grade you're in. High school, college, middle school, whatever. That'll give me kind of an idea of how to have my remarks here. Okay, excellent. So I'll just start by giving a little bit of background. Did you have something that you wanted to say, Tate?
Yeah, Marcus just wants me to just record this session, just advising.
Okay, excellent. That is cool. Just graduated, play alto. We got a clarinet player. Excellent. Okay, so just a little bit of background on woodwind doubling. It's been around for a long time. Round about the 16th century, in some of those orchestras, people were already going from oboes to clarinets, oboes to flutes, those kind of things. So it's been around for a long time, and ever since the saxophone came on the scene, by around the 1840s, we were already sort of being put in a position where we were going to play multiple reeded instruments. Adolph Sax, in fact, was a flutist and a clarinetist, so the man who invented this instrument that we call the saxophone, he also was playing other instruments as well. Kind of the heyday for woodwind doublers is kind of the middle of the 20th century. The 40s, 50s, 60s, there was a lot of work for saxophone players, for doublers, commercial work, movies, musicals, touring bands, orchestras. All of those groups were employing musicians. And because as a doubler, you're often given extra pay because of the extra instruments and cartage and things like that, some of those jobs were very lucrative. So that was kind of the time to be a woodwind doubler, especially in Los Angeles, some jobs in New York as well. So those would have been great places to be for a woodwind doubler back in those days. These days, you're most likely to find woodwind doublers in the theater. Broadway musicians, London's West End theaters employ some of the finest woodwind players on the planet, and so those are the places to go to if you're looking for great influences of this art. That's a good place to start. So woodwind doubling in jazz is something that is more and more common with modern jazz arrangements. Some of the expectations are getting pretty extensive. So typically your alto, obviously if we're just taking the standard instrumentation for a saxophone section, 2 altos, 2 tenors, and a baritone saxophone. Baritone saxophone will usually play bass clarinet. The tenors will play clarinet, and the altos will double on flute. So just some composers to be aware of that are known for composing music for multiple woodwinds. Duke Ellington is obviously a very notable one. Maria Schneider, a more modern big band composer. Toshiko Akiyoshi, same kind of thing. Thad Jones, I think that's a name many of you will recognize. I've heard it a couple times today even. Bob Brookmeyer, who studied at the conservatory here in Kansas City. He's also a very modern jazz composer and arranger. Wynton Marsalis, obviously. Quincy Jones, Nelson Riddle, those are all big name arrangers and composers who are famous for writing for multiple woodwinds. So I'm assuming that many of you, if you haven't had any experience with doubling, you're interested in having some of those opportunities or creating some of those opportunities. I just wanted to kind of talk briefly about the pros and cons. The pros, obviously, is you have a lot more opportunities to play. Being versatile means that you're a little bit more marketable. There's a lot more things that you can do. You can expose yourself to different music by playing other instruments. Saxophone in particular is not very popular in orchestral repertoire, so we really don't get a shot to play in orchestras very often. So sometimes it's helpful to be able to play another instrument in order to have some of those kinds of opportunities. The other thing that's great about studying a different instrument is that you can learn new ways to think about music, to think about breathing, to think about the technique on the instrument. So it can really give you some different perspective on how to play music, ways of learning music. I think it's always good to consult a lot of different teachers. So I hope you guys feel the same way. Um, the cons of woodwind doubling. The first one is just the investment of time and money. It's very expensive, as you all know, to purchase a saxophone. If you have to purchase 4 of them, if you're playing soprano, alto, tenor, and bari, you've got a lot of money invested in that already. So on top of that, you also have to take the time to learn how to play all of those instruments. So all of this takes a great deal of time and effort, and it takes away sometimes from your primary instrument, whichever that is, if it's clarinet or if it's saxophone, and it can take away from the time that you might spend working on improv, some of those kind of things. These instruments, while they're similar, they have some kind of nagging finger difficulties. So, for example, the flute. If you're coming from the saxophone, you're used to having all of your fingers down for a note like D or E flat. On the flute, it's not that way. You have to have your E flat key down all the time, and you have to lift up this finger in the middle register, which just kind of adds a little tweak to a system that's very similar, but not exactly the same. So clarinet is a whole different beast, and we're going to talk about that as we get further down here. So just to talk a little bit about how I got into this, in high school, I played in jazz band, obviously, and our director chose very, it was professional level repertoire. We played a lot of Count Basie, which is pretty standard, but we also played music by composers like Don Ellis, and music by Quincy Jones, things like that. One of his favorite records, if you haven't heard it, is called The Quintessence. Quincy Jones, The Quintessence. It's a very beautifully written album. A lot of original compositions, and it's very orchestral in nature. There's horns included, but all of the woodwind chairs are doubling on different instruments there. So we played a lot of the music from that album, and that kind of exposed me to this concept of picking up different instruments within the saxophone section. So I think my first double was soprano saxophone. I got one of those when I was in high school, and then my mother got me a $50 flute at a yard sale. So I started the flute journey pretty early on, but I didn't really get very serious about the flute until quite a bit later. That one was a pretty long journey, to be honest. Let's see. When I got to UMKC, I went to UMKC I should mention college. I picked up clarinet and tenor, and that was through my teacher, James Pisano, who sort of forced me into doing it. I was an alto player. That's all I really wanted to play. I did do some soprano and some flute at that time, but I hadn't played any tenor, and he felt like that was a pretty bad oversight. So I picked up the tenor my last semester of college, and then I also played some clarinet in the Wind Symphony. And that's one of the first things I want to really stress to you guys is while you have this opportunity in high school or college, while you're in the education system, if you have the opportunity to pick up another instrument, do it now so that you have some experiences in, as we call the minor leagues. You know, the chances of failure or the repercussions of failure are not as great when you're not in a professional setting. So getting to play in wind symphony or in orchestra when you're in high school, when you're in college, that really builds your ability to play within a section and to play musically and make music with other people. So I would really highly recommend that, and I'm glad that even though at the time I didn't like it at all, I'm glad that Pisano kind of forced me to do that. So that was really helpful for me. When I was in my undergrad, I had already started to play some professional gigs. A lot of them were dance band type of things, and there I was often asked to play flute and clarinet at that point. Sometimes I would have to fake them a little bit, but I was already getting exposed to kind of what I was in for. Musicals started to become a thing. I played a lot of musicals when I was in college, and even more when I got to Kansas City and graduate school. So when I got to graduate school, I came to UMKC to study classical saxophone, actually. I intended to study jazz, but there was no money for the jazz department. And so I went and played an audition for Tim Timmons in the classical department, and he was able to get me some scholarship money. So it was really handy, just the experience I had had playing classical music and playing, playing styles other than jazz, basically, really did help to get me a scholarship. So it definitely was helpful, and I'm glad that I did that. While I was in graduate school, I studied saxophone. Obviously, got a lot of opportunities to play in the Wind Symphony at UMKC, as well as saxophone quartets. And that's any of those chamber groups. It's sort of difficult to find those opportunities for saxophones, but the saxophone quartet is a very important learning experience. So if you guys have the opportunity, you have 3 friends who also play saxophone and they're pretty good, put them together in a quartet, and I don't think you'll regret it. There's a lot of really beautiful repertoire out there for saxophone quartets, and it's a great experience. So that's kind of just the boring nitty gritty history of, and just telling you a little bit about myself. Do you guys have any questions for me that you're particularly interested in discussing today? I wanted to make sure that I gave you guys a chance to sort of ask some questions and see what you're interested in talking about today. So if you have a chance, go ahead and put that in the chat section. And we'll see what's on your minds today. Oh wow, alto, soprano, flute, clarinet, beautiful. I'm glad to see you guys are already starting to do this a little bit. Tenor, and done a little on flute. Excellent. Okay. So let's keep going here. Get out of here. Oh, that's a great question. So somebody asked about acquiring instruments, and I do have I have some thoughts on this. Obviously, if we all had our druthers, we would be able to throw down however much money it takes to buy a very good quality instrument right from the beginning. I've never really been able to do that, or at least it hasn't happened very often. So I've usually had to make the leap and started with, as I said, my first flute was very, not a very good quality instrument. Same with the clarinet. I borrowed the school's clarinet, I think, many times. Eventually, though, you are going to want to get at least a step up, an intermediate. For clarinets, the E12 is a really good option. That's one of those that you see quite a bit. The R13, many people play an R13, myself included, on clarinet. And those are not wildly expensive, but it's something that in order to justify the expense, you're going to want to have some gigs before you start throwing down money on instruments like that. Flute's the same thing. I feel like my flute journey has taken a lot longer than some of the other instruments, just because it's a completely different kind of idea of what you're doing here. I also learned some things the wrong way from some of my early teachers and developed some bad habits. So breaking those took a lot of, just finding out that I was doing things sort of the wrong way took a long time. And then fixing that obviously takes some time as well. So I've gone through probably 4 or 5 flutes at this point. And I think in retrospect, maybe it would have been better to buy 1 or 2 flutes and make the second one a really, really nice flute that I knew I was going to play for a long time. I've known for a long time that this is kind of what I wanted to do. I wanted to play multiple woodwind instruments. So these days I'm a little more brave in throwing down some decent money on a good instrument right away. I did recently buy an oboe for a show that was a 10-week run of a musical, which is no longer happening due to COVID. So I have a marvelous oboe sitting around at my house that is not getting played currently. But I still have a good one to practice, so I would definitely recommend that, especially on an instrument like the oboe that can be kind of finicky. You want something that's good quality. You can sort of get away with that on a saxophone a little bit more. I hate to insult my own instrument, but you can get away with a not so great horn if you have a really good quality mouthpiece. So maybe at the end we can talk a little bit about equipment a little bit more in detail if you guys have some more questions about that. Okay, so let's talk about some strategies for just learning the other woodwinds. So obviously a lot of changes that you have to make embouchure wise. There's a lot of different sounds that you have to get familiar with. So a really important thing is getting some time in on the instruments every day if you can. I know that it's kind of difficult to make time for all of those instruments, but especially if I'm doing a show, I usually leave a flute out. I might have my clarinet close by so that it's not a hassle to get it out in the morning and just play a few notes at the beginning of the day, just to get your face kind of, wake up a little bit, get the air moving, and just find your tone right away at the beginning of the day. It makes the evening so much easier, especially if you're playing multiple instruments. You don't want to do all of that work once you get to the gig. So I would highly recommend hitting as many of your instruments every day as you can. Another thing that's different about all these different instruments is the resistance. So the resistance on the flute, for example, is practically nothing. You don't really have anything that you're blowing up against. So it can be easy to overblow that instrument. Same with the clarinet. The clarinet probably has the most resistance of the instruments that I play, but it's a much smaller tip opening. So if you're going from tenor saxophone, for example, to the clarinet, it's very easy to use too much air, and you can get a really spread out, not so great tone. I think that was probably the most difficult thing for me on the flute, was just overblowing. And so a big part of learning to play different instruments is kind of knowing what not to do. And a big thing there is just not to treat it like a saxophone, because it's not the same. Many of you who play different saxophones will probably recognize that there are subtle differences between the different saxes. So those differences get magnified when you're talking about a horn that is a cylindrical bore like the clarinet is, as opposed to a conical bore like the saxophone is. The resistance is totally different. For example, some of the easiest notes to play on the clarinet are down at the bottom of the range. The most difficult notes on the saxophone are the ones that are in the bottom of the range. So it's a completely different kind of discipline, and you have to study each instrument individually to kind of figure out what is needed. Let's see. You should always be focused on sound first. The technique will come. Many times these musicals or your jazz band parts that might include a flute or a clarinet part are not technically that difficult, but they may be exposed. So another reason to get your day started with a little bit of long tones and warm-ups is that you will have a good sound right away from the beginning of the day. All right. Some days, it might be a little bit more difficult than others, but you want to make sure that you're putting in that time right away at the beginning of the day. So the other thing is, each of these instruments you want to study as a primary. So at some point, you're all going to have to go through at least some time where your principal concern is playing the flute or playing the clarinet, or if you're lucky enough to have started on the clarinet, then that's great. So you've gotten a pretty good foundation in the instrument. It's still very important to study each instrument, to learn its repertoire, to see what the important aspects of playing them are, and just getting a hold of what your sound is supposed to be. We talk a lot about the concept of sound. And that's basically, do you hear it in your ear? Listening is probably the most commonly spoken word in all of these master classes today. And this is where it comes up here, is that you need to have a good concept of what the flute is supposed to sound like, a good idea of what the baritone saxophone is supposed to sound like. So that's a really important part for me, is just familiarizing myself with the instruments by listening to them a lot. Another thing that we're going to talk about here in a little bit with musicals is just the different styles that are required. So, for example, the clarinet, sometimes you're called upon to play very straight tone, very classically, which is not too big of a deal. That's probably the way that you're used to playing. However, you're often called to do something called klezmer, which is a very distinctive style of clarinet playing. that requires a great deal of practice on its own. It's a different idea of what the clarinet is supposed to sound like, the way it's used. Another example is Dixieland. Dixieland clarinet playing is a very common aspect that you'll have to address too. Saxophone, there are a myriad of styles involved in playing the saxophone. So maybe let's take this opportunity to just talk about some common styles. They don't have to be jazz related, but some styles that you might hear the saxophone playing in. And drop those in the chat if you would. Folk music, okay, yes. Not very commonly, but yes, you do occasionally hear some folk saxophone. M bass, okay, yes, very cool. Anybody familiar with Moon Hooch? That's a very, that's some intense saxophone playing there. Something you don't get called to do very often. Ew. Funk styles, that's a huge one. Is R&B type of saxophone playing. Has its own kind of vibe, and you want to be familiar with players who play that kind of style. So, for example, if you're thinking about a jazz style, obviously you're going to want to think about people like Charlie Parker and John Coltrane. But if you are looking to play an R&B style saxophone solo, do you guys have any ideas of a player that might exemplify that style? Michael Brecker, absolutely. That would be a kind of a later idea. What if you had something that was more 50s style? 50s style R&B, real growly saxophone. Think Shotgun. Earl Bostic, that's a great one. That's a great one. Anybody know who played the saxophone solo on Pink Panther? His name is Plas Johnson, P-L-A-S, Plas Johnson. Another one is Junior Walker and his All-Stars. That's also a really heavy R&B influence, rock and roll style of saxophone playing. King Curtis is another great one. Maceo Parker, absolutely. Much more of a funk type of vibe. For sure. Any others there? What about on the jazz side? So who are, say I wanted to convey a sort of an old style of jazz playing on the saxophone. Who are some influences that I might take advantage of? Johnny Hodges, Lester Young, that's great. Yes. Any others from that? Yes, Harry Carney on the Barry. Earl Bostic. Ethan's a real Earl Bostic fan. That's great. Coleman Hawkins, very cool. Yes, absolutely. Let's move on. Yes, Benny Carter, Sidney Bechet, great. Those are all excellent. How about in more of a bebop vibe? Obviously, Charlie Parker's a big one, the biggest one. Sonny Stitt. Absolutely. Train, yes. Rollins, absolutely. How about, let's think of more of a West Coast, kind of a cool jazz type of thing. Leo Parker, that's another great name. So now West Coast swing or West Coast cool jazz. Who would we think of? Paul Desmond, yes. Phil Woodish. Maybe. A bit of a stretch. Phil Woods is one of my favorites, for sure. Jerry Mulligan is a great one. Stan Getz is another. Warren Marsh. Warren Marsh is another good one. And Lee Konitz. We recently lost Lee Konitz. But he was a real early person in that style. Great. So as you can see, there's a lot of different styles of saxophone playing. It involves a lot. So again, I'm going to say what you guys have heard many, many times up to this point, is that it's really important to listen. And I don't know if any of you are really into musical theater, but what you don't want to do is learn these styles from musical theater. Just imagine learning jazz from listening to Chicago the musical over and over and over again. You're not really getting the whole piece of the pie. So, for example, if I have to be playing some klezmer clarinet or some Dixieland clarinet, I'm going to make sure that I find authentic versions of that style to base my concept on, so that I'm not just ripping off somebody's copy of whatever is going on. All right. Kind of an important part of the job is that you are a keeper of the style, and since musicals often contain multitudes of styles and you're going back and forth between them frequently, you have to be able to call upon them very quickly. So they need to be familiar to you in a way that you can replicate it right away. So that's another important part, another important aspect. So I'm just going to mention some of my specific influences on my individual instruments. Alto sax, obviously Charlie Parker, Cannonball, Phil Woods, Johnny Hodges is a great one. Daniel Defaye is one of my favorite classical saxophone players. So if I'm trying to get my classical sound going again, I would listen to Daniel Defaye, Eugene Rousseau, some people like that. Soprano saxophone, I really love Branford Marsalis, James Carter. Both of those guys are fantastic soprano saxophone players. And Branford even has an album of classical music, which is quite good, but a lot of classical guys turn their nose up at. On tenor sax, probably the biggest one for me is Dexter Gordon. I've spent the most time listening to him. I've transcribed more solos of his than anybody else. Joshua Redman is another big one. Chris Potter, Seamus Blake, and then I mentioned Plas Johnson and Junior Walker for kind of the more rock and roll type of style. Baritone sax, Harry Carney, the original, the originator. Gary Smulyan, Ronnie Cuber, three of my favorites. And then for the flute, I would say James Moody, Craig Handy, who plays with the Mingus Big Band. Frank West is also a fabulous flute player in the jazz style. And then for the classical side, I think that's a really important part of flute playing, is just learning the classical end of things. Keith Underwood is a fantastic flute player and pedagogue, and Thomas Nyfinger is another one. So those would be some names to check out. All of this is available. I'll make sure that I include my notes to anybody who wants them. So Tate, we'll figure out how to get that to everybody. And then on clarinet, Buddy DeFranco, Pete Fountain, Evan Christopher is a really great somebody who plays in the New Orleans style of clarinet playing. Eddie Daniels is probably one of the best woodwind doublers in the universe. He's an incredible clarinet player. He also is a monster saxophone player and flautist. So he's definitely a name to check out, Eddie Daniels. And somebody who's a fabulous local musician who plays clarinet is John Blagan. So if you guys ever have a chance to go out to the Majestic and check out John Blagan, I would highly recommend that. Oh yes, yeah, absolutely. So Tate just put my email address into the chat. So if you want a copy of the notes from today, just send me an email and I would be happy to share those with you. Do you guys have any other questions right now? We're about to get into some playing and some etudes. So if you have any questions, sorry, I'm having to go back and forth between my notes and, okay, great, yes. I have to go back and forth between my notes and the chat. I can't view them at the same time at the moment. Okay, I'm just going to keep going here. Any suggestions for reads? Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. So, there are different opinions here. Some people like to find setups, especially if they're going between multiple woodwinds, that they want to find a setup that is similar from instrument to instrument. So if they're playing, for example, a wide open mouthpiece on their tenor, they're going to find a wide open mouthpiece on their baritone, they're going to find a wide open mouthpiece on their alto. I pretty much have things that are mostly in the middle. So because I took the time to study each one of those instruments kind of on its own terms, I have a really comfortable setup on each one of those instruments. So I don't subscribe to that. I think whatever is comfortable for you is what you should use. That's a great question too, Tate. I'll get to that in just a second. On baritone, so one of the things that can be frustrating in a musical theater sort of situation is that you'll be sitting for, or these instruments rather, will be sitting for a long time, and then you might have to pick it up and just honk out a low B on baritone saxophone. So if you've been sitting there for 30 minutes not doing anything and then have to go something like that, you want to be able to do that. So for me, I find, I don't get the best sound out of a plastic reed, but I use one on most things for baritone saxophone, just because I can get a good sound when I need it, but the sound is there no matter what, and I don't have to be soaking reeds constantly. Everything else, I use cane reeds. I kind of mix things up, so it's not like I play all Van Doren or all Rico or all D'Addario or anything like that. For those of you that are curious, this is a Berg Larsen 110 over a Berg Larsen 100 over 1 metal mouthpiece on my baritone. On alto, it's a Meyer 6 with a V16-3. And then on tenor, it's a Theo Wan with D'Addario Jazz Select reeds, 3 mediums. So as you can see, I kind of mix and match things. So whatever works is what I use. Tate asked a great question about, do you have multiple mouthpieces for clarinet? I think it's probably a good idea, especially if you're going to play a musical like Ragtime or Chicago, something where you've got to really... You're going to have to put a lot of air into the instrument in order to get it to really speak. You don't want that necessarily for, like Carousel or a really typical musical like that. That's going to be much more section playing. That's another consideration, is what book are you playing? Are you playing solo clarinet? If so, then you probably want something a little bit more open, maybe even a jazz mouthpiece if that's comfortable for you. My mouthpiece is a Van Doren B40 Lyre, which I think is really comfortable. I can't quite get a great jazz tone out of it, but that's mostly because it's too small of a tip opening. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend that for everything, but for just straight up fits for most things that I do, that's a really great mouthpiece. All right, so let's go into talking about some warm-up exercises, some exercise books, things like that for each of the instruments. So a typical day for me, if I'm playing a musical that night, is going to start with flutes, just because I want to hit that instrument first, since it's one that I'm not as comfortable with. And it usually takes me a little bit of time to warm up on that particular instrument. I also don't want any, just mild swelling from, playing baritone saxophone or tenor or even oboe. I don't want that to interfere with my flute chops. So I'm usually going to start with the flute, and I'm just going to start with tone studies. Overtones usually is a good place to start. Let's see if I can get my notes here and the chat. Sorry, here we go. So I'll start with low notes usually, because those are difficult. And kind of bouncing around to those different registers of the flute is a really helpful exercise. So you can do that on the low C. So I would start with something like that, something fairly easy to kind of make sure that you're getting all of those different tones out without too much difficulty. Another good thing about that exercise is it forces your ear into service right away. So I'm assuming most of you were here for Matt Otto's clinic earlier today, which was all about ear training. So each time I'm going from one of those notes to the next. I want to hear that next pitch before I try to play it. All right, so most of you are probably familiar with the overtone series. You can play it on the saxophone, you can play it on flute, but it's really helpful for developing a nice, rich, full tone with a lot of overtones in it. All right, which is usually the mark of a really fine saxophone, flute, clarinet sound. A very famous book on tone is this one right here, Trevor Y. Can you see that all right? Okay, cool. And this has a lot of activities in it, most of them just going from, basically the principle is finding a good tone on one of the notes and then bringing that down to each note. So while the exercises are very tedious, it's a really helpful place to start if you're just beginning your work on the flute. Just going down in half steps like that can be a really good exercise as well. I try to practice with a little bit of vibrato and a little bit of straight tone because I want to be able to do both and feel comfortable on either one of those. Something else that I want to be able to do in my flute warm-up, I want to incorporate this, is leaps between the registers. So in the Y book, there's a really nice exercise. And so that leap there, you want to add enough air to propel you to that higher note. And then it'll give you the exercise up a half step, and so there's all 12 keys there laid out for you. So I'll start with something like that, really thinking about tone. If I have an exceptional amount of time, then I'll do some scales, some arpeggios, and those kind of things. So a great book for that are these daily studies by Reichert. So even just the first page, I mean, there's a lot of markings on that page, but for example, it also gets the air flowing, so I didn't take a big enough breath there. But that's a great exercise as well, and it also takes you through all 12 major and minor keys. There's 7 daily exercises in here, and they're all in 12 keys, so that's another great aspect there. The other one, another really famous one, is the Taffanel Gobert. That's just as you can tell, tons of exercises in here, arpeggios and scales, everything you could ever need to know technically about the flute is in this book. So those are just a couple of my favorite warm-up books for flute. Also the De la Sonorité, Marcel Moïse. On the clarinet, so sort of a similar thing. I know that a couple of you are familiar with the clarinet, which is great. For those of you who are going from the saxophone to the clarinet, one of the significant differences about the clarinet that you'll notice right away is that your voicing has to change, and often your tongue position has to change. So one of the first things I'm going to do is try to get my tongue position sorted out. I'm somebody that learned to anchor tongue when I was a young lad, so I don't really tongue very properly on the saxophone. So when I picked up the clarinet, it was really a big stumbling block, was just the articulation and making sure that I was only using a very small sliver of the tongue on the reed. So I'll start off with an exercise that I just try to think about bouncing the tongue off of the reed. So I have a nice fast stream of air, and I'm just kind of I'm not really pushing the tongue against the reed, I'm just letting it bounce along on the air. So arpeggios, I'll play arpeggios that way. Just to make sure that my tongue is exactly where it needs to be. That's very important on the clarinet. And if you've ever picked up the clarinet and had difficulty squeaking, you'll know that the tongue is one big agitator there. The other thing that can be kind of difficult is the voicing. So to me, the voicing on the clarinet, though I hate to describe it this way, is very tight. To me, it seems like there's a very small column of air going on back here. So I was having a really hard time getting that figured out when I was in graduate school. So I took some clarinet lessons, and one of the first exercises that my teacher gave me was this exercise of covering up the bell. So this works a lot better if you're wearing pants and not just shorts. But, you cross the leg, lay a towel down, whatever you need to do, and cover up the bell. You finger the lowest note on the clarinet, which is a low E, and you're aiming for a G sharp. All right, so if you're getting that tone out, that means that your tongue position is probably about where it should be. It's nice and arched towards the back of the throat. So just like we do on the flute, just like we do on the saxophone, you can do bugle calls this way, you can play overtones this way. All right, so that was something that I did a lot when I was really starting to focus on the clarinet. It got me some very funny looks in some orchestras that I had to play in. I don't think that most clarinet players will do that on gigs, but I find that it's a really helpful way to make sure that I've got the right vocal tract position and the right tonguing position, all right, which are very important things when you're playing the clarinet. I feel like, the clarinet is certainly a more difficult version of the saxophone. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with Adolphe Sax, but not only did he invent the saxophone, but he also invented a modern version of the bass clarinet. And I feel like through his understanding of the clarinet, he made the saxophone quite a bit more user-friendly. So you have to really respect the clarinet, the flute as well, but you really have to spend a lot of time with this instrument to make it sound good. So some exercise books that I've found very helpful on the clarinet. There's this massive book, the Close Celebrated Method for the Clarinet. I have not worked through this entire book, but one page that is particularly useful is a page called 68 Exercises for the Mechanism, and it's just a whole lot of exercises that specifically target difficult areas of the clarinet. Those of you who play the clarinet will be familiar with the break. So there's some exercises that go over the break. There's some exercises that really work out the pinky keys. So it's just an excellent book with a lot of really great things to teach you. I'll just pick one of them here. Just back and forth, so on and so forth. So as you can see, they're simple, they're short, but they really target some tricky areas of the clarinet. Another great one are these Krebs, which is a similar type of thing here to the mechanism exercises, but they're just a little bit more involved. There's a lot more to them, and they'll cover a little bit more of the range of the clarinet. So some different articulation, some dynamic markings. So that's a really great book to work on technique as well. These are wonderful etudes, the Rose etudes, 32 etudes for clarinet. And this is one that I think probably most clarinet players are familiar with at some point. They usually work through them in high school at some point. But those are really excellent exercises for working on tone. It's kind of an introduction into the clarinet repertoire. So I would highly recommend those as well. And then the Behrman Celebrated Method for Clarinet, which is just a whole bunch of scales and arpeggios that will keep you busy from now until the rest of your life. I also wanted to take, so I'm going to mention, with all these instruments, all these styles that you're responsible for, this is not something that people master in a matter of a few years. This is something that you have to continually address. You have to keep working on all of these things. You're never really done. So one just really important aspect of playing jazz or woodwind doubling, or there's a lot of things that are this way, but it's a lifetime endeavor, and you need to be patient. You need to be kind to yourself. It's good to be a perfectionist sometimes, but it's also important to realize that this is not easy. It takes a long time to develop these skills. I'm learning all the time. I'm nowhere near done, so there's a lot left for me to do. I really enjoy it, though. I pick up all these instruments and play them because I love the way that they sound. I love playing them, and that's important. So if you don't enjoy the sound of the flute, I wouldn't pick it up. But if you really do enjoy the sound of the flute, I would highly encourage you to give it a try, because it really is a very fulfilling way to play music and be able to do a lot of different things. So I want to make sure that I get to your questions really quick. I'll just show you a couple things on saxophone. First thing I do every single time, make sure the horn's working, make sure nothing sticks. Making sure that all those buttons are working. I might play some overtones. I might play just something to make sure that my concept of sound is in place, and I know what I'm doing here. Just to make sure everything's working. I feel good, comfortable on the instrument. For alto, same kind of thing, you want to play something that you're comfortable with, something that is relevant to whatever gig you're playing. Make sure that the horn is ready to go, everything is working properly, but I'm not going to take this opportunity to play my Seamus Blake transcription for everybody to hear, That's usually something that's pretty well frowned upon, is just over warming up, If I'm playing saxophone on a gig where there's a lot of doubling involved, I'm going to focus my energy on those rather than playing a bunch of loud saxophone for people that they don't want to hear. That's all you need to do. It doesn't really need to be a whole lot more than that. So we're kind of running out of time here. I want to make sure that if you guys have any more questions for me, whatever you want to ask is great. As I see things pop into the chat, I'll address them. A couple things that I also wanted to just mention to you guys. A big part of this job is being organized, making sure that you communicate well with people and that you're not missing anything, not showing up late, not forgetting, sleeping on a gig, forgetting that it's happening. So I think part of this is, you really have to be reliable. You want people to be able to count on you. So make sure that all of you guys are thinking about that reputation, because you start building it the moment you start school, the moment you get into this business. Your reputation is everything. So make sure that you're making good decisions and you're doing right by people. Make sure that if you say that you're going to pay people, that you pay people. Make sure that you can always be counted on to be on time, to wear what you're supposed to wear. That's definitely a thing. If they ask you for a tux, don't wear a black suit. And that you're nice to be around. If you're stuck in a pit, especially if you're doing a long run of a show, nobody wants somebody down there with a bad attitude. So just try to be humble, be friendly, and be an asset to whatever musical situation you find yourself in. Any questions from the Peanut Gallery? Anything that I didn't address that you would like me to address? One thing that's worth mentioning, if I'm sitting in a saxophone section, I've got a bunch. Do you mind if I? Yes, absolutely. Yes, you can absolutely send messages, emails if you think of something later. One quick thing before we go, just a couple of sort of extended techniques, I guess. Subtone on the saxophone is a very useful tool. It's appropriate in a lot of different types of music. Today you don't hear it as much in jazz music. The jazz today is very athletic in nature, so people are bouncing around the horn quite a bit, and it's a little bit harder to subtone, but I think it's a really useful thing to be able to do. So subtone, just a little bit more lip on the reed for me. I'll move my jaw back some just to get a little bit more lip on there. That's a really useful tool. Growls, some people do it by humming into the instrument. I do it by just kind of buzzing at the back of the throat, gargling sort of. Something like that. So those kind of things come in really handy when you're playing specific styles, funk, rock, or if you're just looking for a much grittier sound, those kind of things. That's really handy there. Altissimo sometimes is a good thing to be working on. Probably some of you are already starting to get the hang of that. But just a workable range, at least up to high A, is pretty handy to have. I know if any of you are going to be here on Friday for any of Adam Larson's master classes, he is a master of playing in the altissimo register, so I'm not going to embarrass myself here by trying to do too much of that. But just making sure that you can get up there when needed. It's not something that is crazily comfortable to me, but I'm still able to use them in situations where the music calls for it. Oftentimes, you'll have altissimo parts written in your music, so you want to make sure that that's part of your ongoing practice routines. So I hope this was helpful. An hour goes by very quickly. There's a couple things I wasn't able to get to, but they'll be in my notes. So please, don't hesitate to reach out at any point if you ever need anything. I'm happy to help any and every one of you. So, yeah. Tate, where do we go from here?
I think Marcus is supposed to be pulling us out of the break room if we're not supposed to just press leave room at the bottom right corner.
Okay, gotcha. All right, so don't press leave room.
Well, we can't. But I think Marcus would rather pull us out.
Okay.
I know we did start the hour a little late, so.
So who are some of the what are some of the highlights that you guys have heard over the last 3 days?
For
Particularly great master classes, ones that I need to go back and check out. I heard a little bit of the ones on Monday.
There's some good stuff from Desmond Mason's master class the last hour. I'm not too familiar with the music production, so he definitely schooled me on that.
Yeah. He definitely knows a lot more about that stuff than I could ever hope to. So
yeah,
that's excellent. How about any of the ear training stuff? I know Jeff Harshbarger was giving one on jazz listening, which I heard most of. That was very interesting. That was a good one.
Yeah, it was pretty cool.
Excellent. Any others that you guys are looking forward to?
Let's see what else have we got. This masterclass, to be honest, was my highlight. Oh, there's Rich Wheeler's free jazz improv class tomorrow.
Yeah, I want to try to catch that. I bet that's going to be a good one too.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one.
I want to catch a couple of the Adam Larson ones. I'm sure that those are going to be excellent. I forget what else is going on Friday. Doesn't Eddie have another one that he's doing?
That one's tomorrow.
Okay.
Friday has Adam doing triad pairs and sax technique. Marcus is doing jazz composition at the same time as Adam's sax technique.
Okay.
And then Zach Morrow's doing time, feel, and groove, and Steve Martin's doing application. And now Marcus wants us back.
Okay, cool.